The Opel Kadett has always been a people's car, both in the 1930s of the 20th century, when there was no Volkswagen yet, and KDF existed only as slogans and posters, and in 1962, when Opel reintroduced a model under the name Kadett. In West Germany, this car successfully competed for top positions in sales rankings, at times in the 1980s even dethroning the class leader, the Volkswagen Golf. In 1979, Opel completely redesigned the Kadett, making it front-wheel drive, and by 1984, a new model with the factory designation E debuted. This car was destined for a long life, in 3 phases. First as a popular compact in Western Europe, where it earned the title Car of the Year in 1985, then as an affordable used foreign car in Eastern Europe, and finally, thanks to the Korean company Daewoo, it remained in production until the 21st century. In 1984, angular cars still dominated roads and showrooms. In 1983, the second Golf debuted, which looked much like the first generation. The Ford Escort also had a sharply contoured body, and other competitors lacked smooth lines. Although aerodynamic design had become fashionable since the early 1980s, the Audi 100 and Ford Sierra flaunted flowing shapes, trying to sell the idea of fuel economy and higher top speed. Opel didn't stay behind. Using its fresh front-wheel drive Kadett as a base, it developed an entirely new, sleek and streamlined body. In August of 1984, the car appeared on the covers of automotive magazines. However, it's worth noting that despite the aerodynamic theme in its advertising, the drag coefficient of 0.3 was achieved only by the sporty GSI version, with different bumpers, front fascia, rear spoiler, and tricks like wheel arch shields. The standard Opel Kadett E hatchback had a coefficient of 0.32, and the station wagon 0.34. Thorough German journalists verified these numbers, and the actual figures turned out slightly worse, but still better than the Ford Sierra, which claimed the same 0.34, while real production models showed 0.36 and above. The previous angular Kadett D had a coefficient of 0.39. The second Golf, despite its classic look, had a real coefficient of 0.34. Since the body structure and technical base had to remain from the existing model, and the task of creating a streamlined body becomes harder the more compact the car, Opel engineers were forced to seek compromises. Engineers stood behind the project, and designers had to transform an aerodynamic droplet into a reasonably attractive car. For the sake of airflow, the front end was rounded to the maximum. The rear was raised and narrowed. The intake for radiator cooling was optimized, and an unusual bumper was created with an integrated lower spoiler that merged into the front fascia. Special attention was given to seals between the fascia, headlights, and hood. These seals were designed to partially compensate for uneven gaps that could occur during assembly on the production line. To avoid covering the underbody with panels, the lower edge of the front bumper was shaped so that airflow passed beneath protruding parts and rose only near the rear bumper, whose lower section was also shaped like a spoiler. At least, that's how Opel claimed it would work. In pursuit of aerodynamics, they sacrificed water drainage from the windshield to the roof, creating a smooth transition from the flush-mounted glass to the front pillar. To combat side window contamination, they relied on specially designed side mirror shapes. The side windows were deliberately not aligned flush with the frames to avoid complicating the structure. Conveniently, aerodynamic engineers found that this had minimal impact on drag. However, they did emphasize that specially designed flat wheel covers had a noticeable effect on airflow. They also highlighted the 25-degree angle of the rear window, which, combined with the overall body shape, helped prevent dirt buildup. Still, the rear wiper on hatchbacks remained, insisted upon by the marketing department. Supposedly unnecessary, but since competitors had one, the Kadett had to as well. Overall, Opel spent 1,200 hours on aerodynamic research. While smoothing the body's contours, they also slightly increased cabin space. Compared to the previous Kadett with the letter D, the new model offered 11 millimeters more headroom for front passengers and 9 millimeters more for rear passengers. The cabin width increased by 26 millimeters in the front and 33 millimeters in the rear. Other important changes included redesigned seats to prevent passengers from sliding under the seatbelt, and the belt mount itself became height adjustable, offered as an option for lower trims or standard on premium versions. In three-door models, seat construction was modified to widen access to the rear seats by 6 centimeters. As an option, seat height adjustment within 5 centimeters was available, which, combined with steering wheel height adjustment and new seats, made the Kadett a rather comfortable car. The senior, sport-oriented version received trendy instruments with digital speed and RPM indicators, previously seen only on the Opel Senator and Monza. However, Opel cautiously noted that these liquid crystal displays could be replaced upon request with traditional analog gauges. The engines remained largely unchanged. In 1984, buyers could choose from 6 options. The old 1.2-liter unit producing 55 horsepower, tracing its lineage back to the Kadett of 1962. 2 1.3-liter overhead cam versions with either 60 or 75 horsepower. A 1.6-liter engine delivering 90 horsepower, a diesel of the same displacement producing 54, and a fuel-injected 1.8-liter engine rated at 115 horsepower, available only on the sporty GSI. With this engine, the car was claimed to reach 203 kilometers per hour and accelerate to 100 in exactly 9 seconds. The Golf GTI of that era did it in 9.7. A 5-speed gearbox was standard only on the fast version. In other variants, the 5th gear required an extra charge. Engine and transmission specs were nearly identical to the previous model, so Opel stated that, thanks to the more aerodynamic body, the new car achieved a higher top speed, about 10 kilometers per hour more in each version, and saved 3% on fuel. Therefore, the fuel tank capacity of 42 liters was not increased, despite previous criticism of its limited volume in the earlier Kadett. The Golf had a 55-liter tank. However, the trunk grew slightly to 390 liters, quite decent for a compact hatchback even by today's standards. More importantly for Opel, it meant a 54-liter advantage over the Golf. With the seats folded, the Kadett could hold exactly 1 cubic meter. The suspension layout remained the same, a typical setup for budget compacts. McPherson struts in front and a torsion beam in the rear, but comfort was improved by adjusting the settings and recalculating all rubber components to make them softer. Camber and toe were also slightly revised for better directional stability. Overall, previous issues were addressed. Anti-roll bars were installed on models with at least 75 horsepower. Less powerful versions could be equipped with them for an additional fee. For the 1984 model, the new Kadett came with rather narrow tires, perhaps for aerodynamic reasons or simply to save costs. Base models had tires 145 millimeters wide, the 90 horsepower version used 155 millimeter tires, and only the GSI received 175 millimeter wide tires with a 70 profile and 13-inch diameter, not particularly generous even for a sporty variant. For other versions, wheels sized 175 by 70 radius 13 or even 175 by 65 radius 14 could be ordered for an extra charge. However, 14-inch alloy rims were optional even for the GSI. The wheel rims themselves became lighter by half a kilogram each, resulting in a total weight saving of 2.5 kilograms, since Opel still included a full-size spare wheel by default, while competitors had already widely adopted compact space savers. The brakes were also upgraded, though the main goal seemed to be weight reduction. The booster was 1 kilogram lighter, and overall the manufacturer claimed a 10 kilogram reduction in the Kadett's total weight. The modernization cost the European division of General Motors 1.5 billion Deutschmarks, a substantial sum, but the desire to surpass Volkswagen was strong. Despite this, the new Kadett E was promised to be sold for only 500 marks more than its predecessor. Opel Kadett GSI on test. The first to test the sporty Opel Kadett GSI with its 115 horsepower engine were German journalists from Auto Motor und Sport. This time, they didn't verify the aerodynamics in a wind tunnel, but the car reached a top speed of 201 kilometers per hour instead of the claimed 203, and accelerated to 100 in 9.9 seconds, slightly slower than the Golf GTI. In the test summary, positives included the high-revving engine, solid driving dynamics, and practicality, which was even called exceptional. The comfort of the revised suspension also received praise. Negatives included limited visibility, an awkward digital instrument panel that required getting used to, a very small fuel tank, and, crucial for German autobahns, insufficient straight-line stability. Overall, the car left a pleasant impression. The engine was fairly quiet up to 4,500 RPM, though at high speeds its sound became intrusive, dominating the noise profile, as wind noise was low thanks to refined aerodynamics. Still, the engine didn't annoy the driver or passengers. The 1.8-liter displacement was more than adequate for a compact and lightweight car. It had enough torque at any speed, and the Kadett felt lively. By mid-1980s standards, the compact Opel was quite economical for a sporty car. It could consume less than 9 liters, though the journalists' average during testing was 9.7. Due to the steep angle of the windshield and rear glass, the cabin heated up noticeably even on autumn days, but the ventilation and heating systems performed well. The adjustable upper seatbelt mount was especially appreciated. Any driver, regardless of height, could find a comfortable position. However, the digital instrument panel received detailed criticism. While it was bright and eye-catching, it wasn't very user-friendly. Small displays for coolant temperature, fuel level, oil pressure, and voltage were hard to read, as was the curved tachometer scale. The large speedometer digits, despite their electronic precision, were no easier to read than traditional analog needles. However, the seats and driving position received praise. Lateral support was excellent, and the range of fore-aft adjustment was generous, noticeably greater not only than compact rivals, but even than cars from higher segments. Still, in the furthest rearward position, if a tall driver was behind the wheel, rear passengers had almost no knee room. The folding rear seat made the hatchback a very practical car, although a split backrest required an extra payment of 480 marks, with the car itself priced around 23,000. Power steering was also optional, but even without it, the steering was praised for its light effort. It was noted, however, that vibrations were transmitted to the wheel on rough roads. In corners, the steering was precise and transparent, and the car responded well to driver input, behaving neutrally with a slight tendency toward understeer. A well-tuned chassis, especially considering that many front-wheel drive cars still tend to push wide in turns. The Kadett, even when pushed beyond reasonable limits, remained composed, responded well to throttle and steering corrections, and forgave driver errors. At high speeds, stability was described as average, and sensitivity to longitudinal road imperfections was noted. Overall, the new Kadett didn't behave drastically differently from its predecessor, but it improved in every aspect. Opel managed to strike a good balance between comfort and handling. True, the softer suspension led to more noticeable body roll in corners, though it didn't hinder fast driving. On rough surfaces, the Kadett handled better than its predecessor and didn't cause much discomfort over undulations. In short, it was a well-rounded car. Opel seemed to know this, setting the price confidently. The sporty GSI cost slightly more than the Golf GTI, 22,785 marks versus 22,645. Meanwhile, the Peugeot 250 GTI was available for 19,295 marks, and the Escort XR3i for 20,720 marks. The most popular Opel Kadett with a 1.3-liter engine producing 75 horsepower cost just 16,615 marks. This was the version tested by German journalists in the next issue of Auto Motor and Sport. It was the most common variant. 45% of all Kadetts were sold with this engine. It appealed to young drivers who wanted at least a hint of sportiness, and to respectable family men who valued rear seat comfort for their mother-in-law and trunk volume. Opel tried to please everyone. For the most practical buyers, a low trunk lip was designed, ideal for loading items like garden seedlings. The cabin was slightly roomier, the seats comfortable for long trips with wide adjustment ranges, and for younger drivers, a subtle nod to lateral support in corners. With the 5-speed gearbox, it cost 17,035 marks, while the Golf was priced at 17,385, and the Escort could be bought for 16,445. These three competitors were brought together in a comparative test: Opel Kadett versus Volkswagen Golf and Ford Escort, by the same magazine in 1985, though in their most basic budget versions with 1-liter and 1.2-liter engines. These were far from the most popular choices on the German market. The simplest Golf was chosen by 13% of buyers, the Escort by 14%, and the Opel didn't even reach 1%. But the journalists wanted to find out, were these few buyers smarter than the rest, or just overly frugal? They ordered the cheapest stripped-down cars, each costing 14,320 Deutschmarks, and examined them in detail. They immediately noted that cost-cutting had little effect on body equipment. In earlier years, such versions might have had unlined trunks, but in 1985, the cars looked just as neat and well-finished as their more expensive counterparts. In fact, the Golf looked even better in this form due to the absence of side moldings and some exterior trim pieces. Manufacturers didn't skimp on important components either. Windshields were laminated, headlights were halogen, rear windows had both heating and wipers, seats could be folded, interior rearview mirrors had anti-glare functions, and seat belts were inertia type. Just a few years earlier, all of this would have been optional extras requiring additional payment. Now it was all standard and worked flawlessly. On the road, the standout was today's featured car, the Opel Kadett. On rough surfaces, the body seemed to move independently due to insufficient rigidity. Panels creaked, something rattled, and overall, the interior lacked the solidity of the Golf. The Ford wasn't a pinnacle of quality either, but it behaved slightly better. Each car had its own design quirks, like awkward door handles on the Ford and Opel. But for the cheapest and most practical vehicle, interior space was the key, and here the second-generation Golf beat both the Ford and the new Opel. It offered more room and better seating comfort, though mainly for 4 passengers rather than 5. In Opel, with its teardrop-shaped aerodynamic design, the sharply inward-curved side windows diminished the perceived spaciousness, and in terms of formal dimensions, it was noticeably tighter than the Golf, 5 centimeters narrower in the front and 4 in the rear, which was quite apparent in the compact class. However, for long-legged drivers, the Kadett was the best. It offered 5 centimeters more legroom than the Golf, and the Ford lagged behind Opel by a full 9 centimeters. A tall buyer might well end the comparison there. Everyone else would likely check the trunk. Here, Opel performed well. 390 liters versus 345 in the Golf and 360 in the Escort. Meticulous German journalists also pointed out a detail often overlooked: the permissible load. Ford allowed only 442 kilograms, Opel 502, and Volkswagen 508. So if one followed the manual, the Golf could carry more potatoes or cement. The simplest and cheapest models came with the most basic engines. Ford's 1.1-liter 50-horsepower unit was called Kent, British in origin, dating back to the 1950s, and featured a low-mounted camshaft, just like Opel's 1.2-liter 55-horsepower engine, born in 1962. Volkswagen, however, had a modern 1.3-liter engine under the hood, borrowed from the Polo. It also produced 55 horsepower, but had an overhead camshaft. This engine delivered torque from very low revs, aided by a precise 4-speed gearbox with a crisp shifting mechanism. Nothing to criticize. Opel's engine, despite its formal 55 horsepower, felt weaker. There was a noticeable gap between second and third gears, which made driving uphill more difficult. Ford lagged behind both. Just 5 horsepower less, but significantly slower acceleration and lower top speed. 145 kilometers per hour versus 159 for Opel and 161 for Volkswagen. Acceleration to 100 took 18.9 seconds, compared to 15.9 for the Kadett and 15.8 for the Golf. At low speeds, however, the Ford was more pleasant. Peak torque came at just 2,600 RPM versus 3,600 for Opel, making the Escort feel smoother and more comfortable in city driving. Low engine vibrations, gentle throttle response, and strong low-end torque, although it too had a gap between second and third gears. The 5-speed gearbox was available only as an option for Opel, but German journalists rightly noted that an overdrive gear on low-powered engines with modest torque is rarely used in real life, so paying extra for it made little sense. Volkswagen, unlike Ford, had a harsher engine feel and sluggish throttle response. Opel, while starting faster in cold conditions than its rivals, suffered from rough engine operation, unstable idle, and jerky gear changes. Still, the Kadett consumed the least fuel, an average of 8.3 liters during testing, while the Ford burned 8.8 and the Volkswagen 8.9 liters per 100 kilometers. However, saving half a liter didn't spare Opel from more frequent refueling. Its tank held 42 liters compared to 48 for the Ford and 55 for the Volkswagen. Comfort was a more revealing category. While cheaper versions of the competitors didn't differ much from their pricier counterparts, the differences between the cars themselves were significant, and here Opel fell short. It wasn't a bad car per se, the rivals were simply better. On uneven roads, the soft suspension caused excessive vertical movement. Seat comfort was inferior to the Golf's, lacking lumbar support, with stiff and uncomfortable headrests and mediocre rear seats. Add to that cabin noises, creaks, and even rattling at moderate speeds. Ford fared worse in terms of body movement. Journalists wrote that the Escort danced, swayed, and wobbled. Apparently, the shaking was quite pronounced. Still, with a full load, things improved slightly. The seats were comfortable, and in terms of noise levels, the Ford outperformed its rivals, both in measured data and subjective impressions. The Golf proved to be the most balanced. Its front seats were flawless, and the rear ones were described by German journalists as 2 classes above the competition. The suspension handled bumps confidently, and noise was only noticeable from the tires, though at low speeds the Golf felt a bit stiff. Interestingly, the base Golf lacked central air vents on the dashboard, a sign of cost-cutting. But in the Opel, especially on sunny days, things were worse: weak ventilation and strong cabin heat. The Ford was slightly better, but overall all 3 cars matched the average comfort level of the 1980s. And of course, the driving dynamics of these budget cars. 10 years later, used car buyers wouldn't care about handling nuances. They'd be checking overall condition and looking for signs of Lithuanian welding. But here, no surprises. Volkswagen was nearly the benchmark. It handled corners simply and predictably, even for inexperienced drivers. The Golf tracked straight at any speed, didn't nosedive under braking, didn't understeer or oversteer, and forgave driver errors, though the steering was heavy and the brake pedal required firm pressure. The Kadett, while generally predictable and reliable in corners, with its neutral chassis setup, could occasionally snap into sudden oversteer. For drivers who believed in the magic of front-wheel drive, this could be an unpleasant surprise. In corners, the steering sometimes required more input than expected, and the brakes felt spongy. During emergency stops, it was hard to modulate pressure accurately, and the car nosedived significantly. However, seasoned journalists discovered these traits only under extreme conditions. In everyday driving, the car was very safe and predictable, a point they emphasized. Ford was described gently. It wasn't as convenient or agile, but serious flaws were found in its setup, from poor stability on high-speed straights to unpredictable behavior in corners. Depending on speed, radius, and surface, the Escort showed either pronounced understeer, sliding nose first outward, or, conversely, a deep, hard-to-control oversteer, as if the rear end had a mind of its own. There were also jolts from the driven wheels felt through the steering. Only the brakes were truly commendable. In terms of maintenance, Opel was unmatched. Offering low prices for parts and service, its modest fuel consumption was another plus, and its depreciation over time was similar to its rivals. Ford was slightly more expensive to run, though its service network was broader than Opel's. However, it lost value faster. Volkswagen was the most profitable on resale, though its upkeep costs were higher. The results were predictable. Buyers of the cheapest versions got a complete product not far behind pricier trims in consumer qualities. The newest Opel Kadett was a surprise, clearly losing to its arch-rival Volkswagen. The expensive redesign focused on aerodynamics didn't benefit the car much. Some aspects improved, but it still fell short of the Golf. Ford Escort came last, and not just in comfort, but also in safety. Its odd chassis tuning made it unpredictable. Ford had worked hard to refine this front-wheel drive compact from the start of production, but apparently not all issues were resolved. Volkswagen won. The Golf had virtually no flaws, reliable, spacious, comfortable, and user-friendly even in its base trim, and it cost exactly the same as its competitors. Opel landed in the middle, with many shortcomings but cheaper to maintain. That mattered too. It's hard to say what nuances German buyers considered when choosing a new car in the mid-1980s, but the Opel Kadett sold reasonably well. When buying the car, a potential owner faced 105 different configurations. Opel Kadett offered a wide range of choices. In 1985, 8 engines were available, including versions with catalytic converters, which were counted separately. Add to that 3 body styles, hatchback with 3 or 5 doors, sedan, and wagon, plus 5 trim levels, and the result was a price range from 14,320 marks for the base Kadett 1.2-liter LS with 55 horsepower to 24,690 for the Kadett GSI with a catalytic converter. Naturally, there were plenty of options: rear wiper with interval mode, illuminated cigarette lighter, quartz clock, and even side moldings could be added. But unlike its rival, the Golf, despite the variety of bodies and trims, the Kadett lacked engines with 4 valves per cylinder, already offered by Volkswagen in 1985, and had no turbocharged diesel. Opel's 55 horsepower diesel remained a purely utilitarian, slow but economical choice. A turbocharged unit with 82 horsepower would only appear in September 1986, a diesel developed by Isuzu. In spring 1989, British magazine Autocar tested the diesel Volkswagen Astra 1.7-liter D, a great opportunity to compare German and British reviews, as the automotive press across the channel has always been among the most professional and respected. Opel's 1.7-liter diesel was a traditional example of its kind. No turbo, no intercooler, no complex mounts to reduce vibration. By the late 1980s, General Motors may have lagged behind rapid innovation, but their diesel compacts cost only slightly more than petrol equivalents. Savings began at the moment of purchase, not after 100,000 kilometers of driving. 57 horsepower was clearly modest, even for a budget compact. But thanks to strong low-end torque, the car felt lively in city traffic, and engine noise while driving was moderate. Gear changes had to be frequent. Diesel engines traditionally have a narrow operating range. The car accelerated to 60 miles per hour, or 96 kilometers per hour, in 15.1 seconds, quite acceptable even by today's standards, allowing confident flow with traffic. In stop-and-go conditions, the strong idle torque and decent gearbox made driving comfortable, though the British noted the shifting was slightly vague. Where the diesel truly shined was in fuel economy. Average consumption was under 6.5 liters, and the enlarged 52-liter fuel tank gave the Astra a range of 800 kilometers. Driving pleasure, however, was limited. The unassisted steering required 4.5 turns lock-to-lock and remained heavy even during parking maneuvers. British journalists strongly recommended paying extra for power steering. With it, the steering became noticeably sharper and lighter, requiring less than 3.5 turns lock-to-lock. The heavy front end of the diesel version was hard to guide into corners without assistance, but thanks to the strong grip of Michelin tires, sized 175 by 70, and that very weighty nose, the car showed virtually no understeer. It simply followed the intended line. On smooth roads, because any unevenness caused the car to wander off course, which was especially unwelcome in fast corners. Plus, there was significant body roll. The driving position and seats were praised by the British, who noted the height adjustment and called the visibility good, though thick rear pillars sometimes blocked the view at critical moments. Ventilation and controls were approved. Sound insulation was generally solid. The coal diesel engine did rumble at idle, but on the motorway it was nearly silent. In city driving, the unassisted steering was heavy, and on winding roads the effort became tiring. The car leaned in corners and bounced over bumps. But on long highway trips, the diesel Astra was economical and reasonably comfortable. If fuel savings weren't the top priority, the British advised considering a livelier petrol engine. Overall, the assessments didn't differ much from the German ones, but diesel versions attracted little interest in the mid to late 1980s, despite tempting tax incentives, especially in naturally aspirated low-power form. Meanwhile, the Opel Kadett sedan was launched in November 1985. That's a story in itself. How after the first wave of practical hatchbacks, manufacturers came to their senses and started adding trunks to all their small cars. Opel and the Corsa of that era both had trunk-equipped versions. The sedan was especially important for Eastern Europe and Asia. Thanks to Daewoo, these cars would be produced until the early 21st century, and the Nexia sedan, under various names, would outlive hatchbacks and many competitors long gone. The Opel Kadett sedan, in its Korean-Uzbek incarnation, would remain in demand well into modern times. Back in its youth, the new model was thoroughly reviewed by the same German journalists. That happened in November 1985. The Kadett had already been on European roads for over a year, so the basic information was well known. It's worth noting that the Opel Kadett E had a rather slow start. The aerodynamic concept didn't sell as well as expected, and the car turned out to be average overall, especially with strong competitors in the market. Gradually, sales picked up. Opel attracted buyers with low maintenance and running costs, and in August 1985, the Kadett even surpassed the Golf in monthly sales reports, taking first place. But given the weak launch of a model that had absorbed massive investment, General Motors concluded that Opel buyers were staunch conservatives who sorely missed a classic sedan. The question remains why this wasn't obvious earlier, but GM offered no answer. Thanks to its well-designed trunk, the sedan looked far less radical than the hatchbacks, and its volume matched that of the Jetta, 550 liters, with a claimed payload of 495 kilograms. The loading height was lowered to bumper level. Only the wagon was more practical. The revised roofline also provided more headroom for rear passengers. The car's length increased by 20 centimeters compared to the hatch. The sedan drove almost like the hatch, though the suspension was slightly retuned. Transverse joints still jolted the body, and tire and engine noise were clearly audible. Still, the Kadett remained a reasonably comfortable car, and the trunk didn't affect its cornering behavior. The sedan came with 6 engine options, excluding the weakest and most powerful units. The test car featured a 1.6-liter engine with 90 horsepower, accelerating to 100 kilometers per hour in 11.7 seconds and reaching a top speed of 180. Average fuel consumption during testing was 9.2 liters per 100 kilometers, quite economical by 1985 standards. By then, all Kadetts had a 52-liter fuel tank, increasing driving range. Opel had also settled on pricing. The new model cost 18,519 Deutsche Marks. The 90-horsepower Jetta was noticeably more expensive at 19,340 Deutsche Marks, and even Ford's Orion sedan was 90 marks higher. The difference was small but telling. Naturally, Automotor und Sport compared the trunk-equipped Kadett and the Jetta in January 1986. First, they checked the claimed trunk volumes. The Golf offered 531 liters, while the Kadett had only 495. Still, the Kadett was deemed more practical. Its low loading lip and folding rear seatback made it ideal for bulky cargo. Both cars had 90 horsepower, but Opel's engine displaced 1.6 liters, while Volkswagen's had 1.8. And here, textbook logic applied. The Jetta's engine pulled well from low revs, while the Opel's had to be revved high to deliver performance. While the Volkswagen pulled confidently even in 5th gear, Opel's overdrive was suited only for smooth, steady cruising on the Autobahn. Overall, the Jetta was described as a more balanced car with a well-matched engine. However, Opel was sold at a lower price and, according to German journalists from 1985, looked more visually harmonious. It's worth noting that the exterior designs differed so much that they could easily become a decisive factor. The avant-garde, slightly bloated Opel versus the sharp, clean lines of the Jetta. The rapidly aging look of the Kadett was refreshed in 1989. A pronounced grille was added, and the car was brought in line with Opel's new family styling, similar to the Vectra and Omega. The interior was slightly revised. A new 3-spoke steering wheel appeared, the light and fan switches were redesigned, previously criticized by journalists, and the headrests were updated. The dull plastic was brightened with more colorful seat upholstery. More important were the technical upgrades, especially the anti-lock braking system, which became standard on some Kadett versions. This ABS was a new generation unit with microprocessor control manufactured by German firm Bosch. In premium trims like CS and GSI, it was included by default, while simpler models required an extra payment of 2,000 marks. By then, Opel had introduced a new generation of engines, smoother and more responsive, but overall it was still the same Kadett. Though it never overtook the Golf, it consistently held second place in sales rankings. For example, in January 1989, the Golf sold 23,516 units, while the Kadett was purchased by 16,253 drivers in West Germany. In third place was the Volkswagen Passat with 11,573 cars, closely followed by the Mercedes-Benz W124. This meant that, along with the Golf, many Kadetts would soon leave Germany as used cars, solid, reliable vehicles. They would appear across the former Soviet Union, but Germans themselves also bought used cars. In February 1994, a short article was published about second-hand Kadetts. In just 2 pages, it offered invaluable information for any buyer. A breakdown of used car prices, a detailed history of upgrades, from suspension and engine tweaks to changes in factory-installed radios. There was also a section covering the most common faults and breakdowns, prices for popular spare parts, strengths and weaknesses of the car, recommended engines, and defect statistics by age of used vehicles. It was noted that severe rust was especially typical of the earliest models, while 7-year-old cars only began to show signs of corrosion. Common issues included worn drive shafts, oil leaks, misaligned headlights, damaged dust covers, and a handbrake that worked only on one side. Overall, it was a brief but dense summary of aging Kadetts. Nothing particularly critical, no major engine problems were reported nor serious transmission issues, even though some cars were nearly 10 years old at the time. The price chart was especially informative. It showed approximate values for 3-, 5-, and 7-year-old cars in decent condition, and it was easy to compare those figures with local prices for undamaged, unpainted, customs-cleared vehicles, and imagine what kind of junk they were assembled from. The Kadett remained in production until 1991, though cabriolets were built until May 1993 by Italian firm Bertone. By the early 1990s, General Motors decided to unify not only its European models, but also their names. Instead of Opel Kadett for continental Europe and Volkswagen Astra for the UK, the name Astra was adopted for both, though in Britain it remained a Volkswagen, of course. Opinions vary on the aerodynamic experiments of the early 1980s. Not everyone liked the rounded, softened shapes, but the Opel Kadett E undeniably became a true people's car. As a mass-market compact in 1980s Germany, as a used import in Eastern Europe, and as an affordable new car under the Daewoo brand. But that's a whole other story.